UNCITRAL. These webinars, for those of you who are joining us only today, form part of a series on UNCITRAL texts, COVID-19 response and recovery. Today we're looking at two topics, as we did yesterday. We're looking at procurement and infrastructure development. Both have a long history in UNCITRAL. The first model law on procurement of goods and construction dates back 1993, and the UNCITRAL privately financed infrastructure projects legislative guide was adopted in 2000. Very recently, this legislative guide has been updated with, including with model legislative provisions on PPPs in 2019, and the model law on public procurement in its guide to enactment date back to 2011 and 2012. In both these areas, it is clear that the COVID-19 pandemic has had lots of unforeseen and unprecedented consequences. And both these UNCITRAL instruments on procurement and PPPs envisage and provide for changing circumstances and adaptation to new realities caused by unforeseen events, such as the situation we are all going through currently. This is what we will be discussing today, and I will introduce our two moderators. First, someone you all know very well, Mr. Angelo De Santis, who is the chief of our legislative branch in UNCITRAL, who oversees all the work of UNCITRAL's working groups. He will be moderating the part on PPPs, and to moderate the panel on public procurement, we have the pleasure of Mr. Reto Malacrida joining us. Reto is counselor and head of the Government Procurement and Competition Policy Group with the IP division of the WTO Secretariat. And as such, he has acted as secretary to the WTO Committee on Government Procurement and has been working very closely with our colleagues here, particularly Caroline Nicholas, on public procurement. So without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Angelo to introduce and moderate our first panel on PPPs. You have the floor, Angelo.
Thank you very much, Anna, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the participants who join us for today's webinar on PPP and public procurement. It is for me a great pleasure and a privilege to moderate the first panel on PPPs. It is a topic to which I have some association because it was actually the first project that I had to oversee in the UNCITRAL Secretariat back in '96 when we started the work that led to the adoption of the UNCITRAL legislative guide on what was then called privately financed infrastructure projects. That guide was adopted in 2001. It was complemented in 2003 with a set of model legislative provisions. And already at that time, the Commission had anticipated that the two instruments would eventually be merged in one single publication. That eventually happened in 2019 when we adopted the revised UNCITRAL guide, renamed now Legislative Guide on Public-Private Partnerships, including a set of model legislative provisions. What happened between the two instruments? What happened between 2003 and 2019? Actually, a lot had happened in the world, and that is why the Commission agreed that it would be useful to update the guide, but not only update, but also to expand a little bit its scope and take into account a few other developments. The expansion of the scope was to now cover not only the classical infrastructure projects that the original guide was dealing with, but also to cover public-private partnerships, including arrangements whereby the private sector, for instance, manages a public facility or other types of arrangements not necessarily linked to the development of new infrastructure. But second very important development in the meantime had been the tremendous progress made by the international community in developing standards to fight corruption, money laundering, and other illicit affairs, in particular to the UN Anti-Corruption Convention, UNCAC. And UNCAC contains various obligations for contracting states to ensure integrity and transparency in procurement to curb corrupt practices. And it was felt that the guide should reflect those developments accordingly. It's not that we had ignored, the Commission had ignored that in the first edition, is simply that at that point in time, the Commission took a more cautious approach in dealing with matters that were considered to be administrative law matters, such as the institutional domestic setup for carrying out PPP projects. Now, with the clear mandate reflected with UNCAC, it was also obvious that the guide needed to be adapted to that. But also the guide took into account developments in the experience with PPPs around the world, not only in terms of the administrative arrangements, institutional arrangements set up to ensure a proper preparation and feasibility studies for the project, but also in terms of compiling and transmitting knowledge about PPPs, for instance, through PPP units, which many countries had developed. So this is also something that was taken into account in the new guide. Another important element, new element in the new guide was a more stringent regime for dealing with unsolicited proposals and direct negotiations in PPP. The original guide, even though it had already advocated public procurement and competitive bidding as the standard for awarding PPP contracts, was somehow deferent to the legal traditions of some countries that had in the past used direct negotiations as a common source for selection of partners under concession agreements and similar public service contracts. Now, that had changed in the meantime, and the guide now could now in 2019 much more clearly and forcefully stress the idea that competitive bidding is the main source, is the main process for selecting the concessionaire and a PPP, the partner in a PPP contract. So with that, it also revised the conditions for award of contracts and unsolicited proposals, and also for granting contracts under direct negotiations. And one important point concerned actually the topic about which many of the speakers today would be making their remarks, and that is adaptation of contracts to change circumstances. We know that this is the nature of many PPP contracts to have contract adaptation clauses to take into account supervening events, be they variation orders imposed by the contracting authority, be they changes in economic circumstances, be they force majeure events. Now, the experience with that clauses has also been mixed around the world. In some countries, they found to be useful to make sure that the private partner remains on board and is not making a loss over the time of the contract. At the same time, caution has been advocated on handling contract adaptations to the extent that cumulative changes may lead to a final balance, a financial balance between the contracting authority and the private sector that would be a complete variance with the basic assumptions at the time the contract was awarded in terms of overall cost for the public sector. And this in particular was One of the substantive provisions of the guide that was extensively amended was model provision 45, dealing with contract adaptations. And I'm very happy that we're able today to secure the participation of 3 distinguished speakers, who each of them would present not only her or his thoughts on this matter, but also recent experience, including experience related to COVID-19 and PPPs. So the first speaker that I have the privilege to introduce is Professor Laurence Folliot-Lalliot. She's a professor of public law and co-director of the Master II in Economic Law and co-director of the Center of Research in Public Law at the Paris Nanterre University. She has been a consultant with the World as a senior legal counsel in public procurement with the World Bank for a number of years, and since being a consultant on procurement and PPP reforms in several countries, and worked with other international organizations such as the OECD and the EU. She has very recently also published an article for review concurrences on COVID-19 lessons learned in public procurement, time for a new normal. And that, I think, is a very clear indication of how dear this subject is to her. The second speaker is Mr. Vladimir Kilinkarov. He's a counsel and head of Russian PPP practice of Dentons chambers in St. Petersburg. For more than 10 years, Vladimir has advised public authorities and investors on various aspects of structuring, preparing, and implementing concession and other PPP projects in Russia. He has participated also in the revision of the UNCITRAL legislative guide as an expert. He also participated in other international initiatives on support of legislative standards on PPPs, such as initiatives promoted by the European Bank on Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, and the UN Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE. He's also a member of a number of expert councils in the major Russian associations and institutes for PPP. The third speaker is Professor Fuguo. Fuguo is a professor of law at the Law School of Central University of Finance Economics and Dean of the Chinese Academy of PPP Governance at the Central University of Finance Economics in Beijing, China. He's a panel member of the review panel for the national PPP model projects established by the Ministry of Finance of China and co-author of a white paper on PPP best practice. He was also actively involved in the drafting of the UNCITRAL model law on procurement as a Chinese delegate. I think you agree with me that we have a very distinguished panel of speakers. And with that, I would turn to Laurence, who will discuss how the UNCITRAL model legislative provisions and the guide enable states to respond to the COVID crisis by providing equal and fair treatment of parties to PPP contracts. She would also relate to her experience, current experience in Senegal, and provide practical examples. Laurence, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Angelo. I hope you can hear me. I hope you'll be able to, this is these are my slides, but the old version. Anyway, thank you for the invitation and the kind words. It's always a pleasure to work with UNCITRAL and thus to contribute to finding solutions in the midst of this terrible world crisis. My intervention is going to underscore the role that could play the UNCITRAL legislative guide on PPP in regarding the performance of the contract. Indeed, and you can go to the next slide, what we are facing today is not only a new case of force majeure, as I put it, but I would say a new sort of force majeure, because it's a multi-dimensional force majeure. One virus, but a multi-dimensional force majeure, addressing and causing several issues. Multiple issues which depend on the type of PPPs. For example, user space versus public paid PPPs won't be affected the same way. The fields, the sectors, in the IT sector, for example, we could think that maybe the crisis was less important that it was in the transport sector, for example, or the tourism sector. And also we have to take into account the phase of the contract. Construction versus performance. Again, the issues faced by the contract will be really different. During the performance of the contract in particular, rising cost in every dimension, in every type of cost would be affected because there will be suspension of the performance, new health requirements and cost, rising price in the furniture, the products, the goods, all the things that are used by the companies due to a shortfall of supplies, a fall of demand, employees who do not show up to work, so, and the debt as well. So a lot of issues. And so how to manage so many parameters while ensuring the continuity of the contract? You can go to the next slide, please. This risk allocation is really at the core of the crisis for PPPs and during the performance of the contract. It's necessary to look for a balanced answer, taking into account both the private partner situation, of course, and the public needs for the continuity of the service operation. So how to maintain the viability and the sustainability of the contract, not only on a short perspective, but also on a long-term perspective. So the question is about the risk allocation, the model of risk allocation that had been decided from the beginning of the contract. Is it definitive or is it adaptable in PPPs? What is interesting with the legislative guide is that actually it provides for a consensus of legal traditions. It's based on different legal traditions. So it offers a combination of solutions grounded in both the civil law approach, which is more based on principles like the definition of force majeure, for example, and on the other hand, I would say the common law approach, which is prone to promote risk matrix and a very detailed list of risk faced by the contract that could be potentially faced by the contract. So if you could go ahead, please, next slide. And actually, the UNCITRAL PPP guide is able to answer and to provide some answers to this crisis. First of all, several of the provisions are actually able to anticipate such unforeseen crises, not only because there is anticipation of force majeure issue, but also because there is anticipation of, in French, what we call the imprévision or hardship issues due to economic cost. There is also anticipation of what in the France we call fait du prince, which are increase of cost due to specific new mandatory requirements imposed by the public entity. For example, now the employees should follow specific health requirements. So of course, it creates new burden, new cost for the companies. What is also provided for by the guide is actually a look for permanent dialogue between the parties. And I think the guide insists a lot on this aspect, and it is really important when, of course, parties are facing a situation like this. And here I can give you an example from Senegal, where I currently been living. In Senegal, there is a highway going from the capital, Dakar, to the new airport, 50 kilometers far away. And this highway has been built and is operated under a concession, so a PPP, a users paid PPP. And it has been in place for 2 years, I mean, operated for 2 years. And the civil society, the citizens, the government were complaining about the cost and the price of the tolls. But they were on the verge of discussing this issue, and the government was even considering to change the financial conditions of the contract, which is something very difficult to do under such type of contract. But then the COVID arrived. And the COVID crisis actually demonstrated that the company was indeed able to continue to perform the contract without any financial help from the government. And everybody was actually very happy that this concession and the road going to the airport and other towns were still operated in good condition. So it shows you that, of course, conditions are changing, and the dialogue among the party is really a crucial matter. Another aspect as well, which is promoted by the guide, is the adjustment of the contract. And then you can go on the next slide, please. And actually, the guide has several tools to provide for, legal tools and economic tools. Legal tools through amendment, negotiation, extension of the duration of the PPP, and if it's really necessary, different type of terminations, and of course, force majeure is one of the parameter, termination by the public entity, termination by the private partner, or by either parties. And these legal tools are not just there for being legal tools, they are there actually to provide for economic tools and economic solutions, such as short-term help that could be requested by the contractor, the partner, in order to continue the performance of the contract. And it is also in the interest of the public entity looking for the continuity of the service. There is also sort of long-term help with contract amendment that could be discussed among the parties in order to change the equilibrium of the contract, allowing for the flexibility of the contract and its continuity. Of course, I could continue during the Q&A question, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurence. And I'm sure that there will be questions that the audience will be asking on your views on contract adaptation, in particular as regards to COVID and your experience. Now we move to our next speaker, and Vladimir will report on recent amendment package on the PPP legislation in Russia. And that is the culmination of a 2-year process of work with the Ministry of Economy and various experts, and the way this legislation expressly addresses special circumstances and risk sharing in case of change of circumstances in the life of the contract. So Vladimir, please.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Stropharia. Again, thank you. And my presentation will be a good continuation of what was previously said by the presenter, by the previous presenter. I will talk a little bit about the impact of the COVID-19 on the Russian PPPs and how we address this impact in the Russian PPP legislation, and about the influence of the UNCITRAL legislative guide and model provision on PPPs on the whole situation with amending Russian legislation. Okay, just in few words about the Russian PPP legislation. We have two major PPP laws. It's a concession agreements law, which was adopted in 2005, and another PPP law, which was adopted 10 years later in 2015. And these are more or less equivalent laws, and the new PPP law is not a kind of umbrella regulation. It constitutes a separate PPP model instrument, which is usually called PPP agreement, against the concession agreement, which was provided in the concession agreements law. And the criteria for distinguishing between these two models is different to traditional ones. It's not about the Russian PPP agreements are not about the risk of demand vested on the public side. There are other key differences between PPP agreements and concessions, which are the first one, the private partner becomes the first owner of the created facility in the PPP agreement. And in concessions, the first owner of the reconstructed or constructed facility is always a public partner. And another key criterion is, I would say, target operation of the facility. In the concession agreement, private side always needs to operate and maintain the facility, both of these two types of activities. And the PPP agreements are more flexible. The private side can either operate or maintain, or both operate and maintain the facility. These are two key criteria to distinguish. And I would say that these two laws over the years were quite developed, and at the moment just need fine-tuning. And there is a serious discussion in the parliament, in the government, about, and on the market, of course, about the further adapting of this PPP legislation to the pressing needs of capital investments. And in this situation of COVID-19, this need becomes more and more pressing. We need more projects to be done and more investments to be attracted to infrastructure. And we, of course, need to provide more flexibility and guarantees to the private sector. And I'm sure that the UNCITRAL legislative guide and the model provisions on PPPs are a much help in this situation. And we see that in our discussions in the government, this is always a good argument, because the guide is a major global legislative guide on PPPs. And of course, it is a code of widely accepted principles for national parliaments and governments, including Russia. These are the main macroeconomic impacts on the Russian economy and infrastructure. The first one is COVID-19, and another one is Russian-Saudi Arabia oil price war. Both of them have considerable impact. The first one is mostly about the government anti-COVID measures, like borders closing, stoppage of activities, epidemiological measures, which cause delay in works and services delivery, delay in taking decisions and performance by the public partner, additional costs, and loss of revenue. Decrease in traffic or demand. And the second factor caused a serious ruble exchange rate decrease, and the ruble lost around 15-30% against both euro and US dollar, which of course affected the costs and increased costs for materials and equipment. And this is how our legislation addresses these two impacts. There are two groups of instruments that can be used in such situations. The first one needs special provisions in the contract, and the second one is provided by default in our PPP and civil legislation. Within the first group, you need special provisions in the contract, which first formulate particular obligations of the public sector in the PPP contract, and such government measures, even when they're legal and have particular grounds, they anyway will be qualified as a breach of a contract by the public partner. This is the first type of provisions. The second one, a special, so-called special circumstances. There's a list of events that needs to be explicitly listed in the contract, and they're mainly being third-party actions or macroeconomic effects. and they trigger special obligations of the public partner in the contract regarding recalculation of time periods, contract adjustment, exemption of the private party from the liability for delays and failures, and compensation for losses, both cost increase and loss of revenue. And the third type of instrument is termination of the agreement with a sufficient compensation provided in the PPP contract, including, for example, interests on shareholder loans. And the other group is more or less known and mentioned today. It's hardship provisions in our civil legislation, so-called material change of circumstances, and force majeure. And I think we can step forward. And it would be okay if those instruments were would be clearly provided by the legislation and easily used and applied by courts, but this is not the Russian case at the moment. And we have a serious uncertainty in the legislative provisions in Russia regarding, first, the possibility of demand and revenue guarantees, such as a minimal income guarantee, which is not clearly provided by the PPP and concession laws. The second, ability of the contracting authority to indemnify the private partner for and against special circumstances. Like orders of the public authorities, including public authorities of different level, because in Russia we have federal authorities, regional and local, and not all of these authorities would like to take the responsibility for the actions and decisions of the other. And these actions cannot be considered as a delay of failure or to comply with the obligation of the public partner, and this is a problem in our legislation. And the third is uncertainty about the losses of the private party that can be compensated upon termination of the project agreement. We have sometimes limited compensation that cannot cover all investment costs, and this is there is a serious uncertainty in our legislation. And these instruments are widely used in the Russian PPP practice, which is good. And the market is pretty sure about the importance of these instruments. Even our public partners, our regions, our authorities, they're sure they need it. But there is no stable court practice, and sometimes the courts do not enforce such provisions, which is unacceptable for the market. And the good thing is that UNCITRAL and the model provisions that are listed on this slide, I think have clear understanding and provisions on all of these instruments. And I think that such provisions can be, again, a good argument for our government to make these provisions much more clear. And we have the further discussion in Russia, not only how we can and should address the COVID-19 problems and how we need to compensate to the infrastructure project, but more about stimulation of investments in the public infrastructure, what we need to do and what we can do from the legislative perspective. And again, in this situation, UNCITRAL legislative provisions are much help. For example, we are discussing about the flexibility of financial arrangements in our legislation, namely, we need to cover all construction costs by liability payments, by demand or revenue or profit guarantees, by public demand, procurement guarantees, and so on. And they are clearly defined, more or less clearly defined by the UNCITRAL legislative provisions. The same about compensation for proponent expenses incurred in preparing a solicited proposals, which could drive the private initiative and these kind of projects, and could seriously stimulate more investments into this area. And the same about the flexibility regarding the nature and scope of the works to be performed, services to be provided by the private partner, as well as ownership of the infrastructure facility. We need more flexibility in our legislation regarding these issues. And the same about removal of exhaustive list of facilities in our legislation. And we need to shift it to the list of sectors or the list of activities which may or may not be the object of the PPP contract. And I reached the end, and I think indeed the UNCITRAL legislative guide and model provisions are a very good argument, de lege ferenda argument for all these lawmaking discussions in the government would be much help for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. It's always a pleasure for us to hear that the work we do can actually have a practical impact and can be helpful to legislators around the world. And I suspect you might be listening to a similar message also from our next speaker, Fuguo, who would tell us how Chinese law deals with changes in cost structure, revenue stream of PPP contracts following governmental measures such as those that were decreed around the world to deal with the COVID-19 crisis, and the possible benefit of the approach taken on UNCITRAL model legislative provisions. Thank you again, Vladimir. And now I, without further ado, give the floor to Fuguo. Fuguo, please.
Oh, hello. Yeah, you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Fuguo.
Yeah, wonderful. Sorry, I see that the camera. My camera is a problem. I haven't fixed it. I have to make the presentation in blank. Hello, Laurence, and hello, Vladimir. Hello, dear colleagues. And the first one, share the screen. So my point is that some connection between the continuation public service and the contract amendment in COVID-19 response and recovery, and focusing on the UNCITRAL PPP model legislative text and the Chinese law. I would come to the next slide. You know, in the UNCITRAL model provisions, there's a requirement for the private partner of a PPP project to provide continuous public services, mostly provided under Article 33 and 43, but maybe more than that. For example, it's model provision 19 concerning evaluation criteria, which include quality of service and the measures to ensure their continuity, right? And Article 23 concerning the circumstances authorizing direct negotiation, in which there is an urgent need for ensuring continuity in the provision of the services. And under model provision 33, the contents and implementation of the PPP contract, the requirement for the private partner to continue the provision public services, and Article 43, the operation of the infrastructure, is also quite a requirement for the extended provision of continuous provision of public services. And the Chinese law, we have a similar requirements, even in the case of emergency and in the case of any disputes. the private partner are required to have the emergency plan there to ensure the normal provision of public products or public services. And in the event of any disputes which it might arise, and continued performance of the contract and provision of public services is a legal requirement. So on one hand, there's a requirement for continuity of public services, and on the other side, there might be some cost increase or loss of revenue in cases such, in extraordinary cases such as the COVID-19, right? And in the Chinese case, for example, there is a government requirement for free vehicle tolls from January 17th to the 6th of May, in order to encourage self-driving to avoid, the risk of taking a public transportation. So we have a dilemma. On one hand, there is a legal requirement on the private partner to continuously provide public service, but on the other side, there the extraordinary situations such as COVID-19 really created a huge unprecedented difficulties for the private partners to go on with the provision of public services. So there has, something has to be done. The UNCITRAL model legal provisions actually anticipated this circumstances. When the change in economic financial equilibrium renders the performance of those obligations financially hazardous compared to what was originally foreseen at the time that the PPP contract was concluded. Specifically, model provision 45 regarding the amendment of the PPP contract, and the PPP contract shall further set forth whether or to what extent the private partner is entitled to request the amendment of PPP contract in the event that the cost of the private partner's performance of PPP contract has substantially increased, or that the value that the private partner receives of such performance has substantially diminished as compared with the cost and the value of the performance originally foreseen as the result of changes in economic and financial conditions, provided that the economic financial changes occur after the conclusion of the contract, are beyond the contract of the private partner, and are of such a nature that the private partner could not reasonably be expected to have taken them into account at the time of the PPP contract was negotiated, or to have avoided or overcome their consequences. Interestingly, very interestingly, encouragingly, and such a provision of changes in condition is provided in the recently enacted Civil Code of the People's Republic of China, which is to be effective on January the 1st of the next year. So this is the first time that China, the Civil Code enacted a specific provision on the changes in condition. The new provision provide that where the basic conditions of the contract undergoes a material change unforeseeably by the parties at the time of contracting after the formation of the contract, rendering the continuation of the performance of the contract unconscionable for either party, the adversely affected party may renegotiate with the other party. And if the renegotiation fails within a reasonable time, the party may request the People's Court or an arbitration institution to modify or rescind the contract. So it is also interesting to note that the changed condition article in the new civil code institutionalized a renegotiation requirement into that provision. And in I should come to the next slide. I go a little faster than the pages. Okay, and in a notice by the Supreme People's Court, specifically in relation to hearing civil cases concerning the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is mandated that the renegotiation procedures must be there in place. Without such, specifically, if one party, it specifically required, if one party only feels it difficult to perform a contract due to the pandemic or pandemic prevention and control measures, the party concerned may renegotiate the contract. And if the parties can continue performing the contract, the People's Court shall strengthen the efforts in mediation and actively guide the parties to continue the performance. The People's Court shall not support a party's request to dissolve the contract due to difficulty in performance. So it appears the cost attitude is that it encourages the renegotiation before you request the court to dissolve the contract. Without such kind of pre-renegotiation procedure, the court will not support your request. And some local government, in practice, a number of them, I find two governments, the Beijing municipality and another province, which is specifically addressed the cost, the projected cost increase or the timeline or duration of the project. It requires some kind of adjustment affected by the COVID-19. And okay, I don't have a specific content of that opinion there, but in that notice, the cost endured by the containment response measures of COVID-19 pandemic are paid by the government, meaning the government agreed to pay any additional cost endured by any response or containment measures, and which is good for the private partner. And so we can see it is an interesting coincidence that both the UNCITRAL and China enacted a new provision on the changing conditions in cases such as COVID-19, extraordinary circumstances such as COVID-19. But contract amendment is not without the limitation. And in fact, the UNCITRAL tax have in place some qualifications on such changes, specifically Article 45, subparagraph 5, provided the contracting authority may not accept any amendment or modification to the PPP contract of the type referred to in paragraph 2 that would render the contract substantially different in character from the one initially concluded. No similar qualification under the current Chinese laws are found, but hopefully this will be enacted in future China legislations, either in the government procurement law or PPP law, which we are now in a process of either amendment of procurement law or enacting new PPP laws. So with that, I conclude my presentation. I will welcome questions, and thank you for your attention. Angelo?
Thank you very much, Fuguo. And I'm sure again that your presentation has provided a lot of food for thought for our Q&A session. In the interest of time, what we're doing is we're moving straight on to the next panel, and then we have the Q&A session at the end. I remind those states that would like to use the opportunity of making a statement or a comment in the slots reserved for states that encourage them to do so. But please enter your wish for making comments through the Q&A facility to the chat in the WebEx platform, stating your state first, the state that you're representing, so that we can give you the floor accordingly. So with that, then I would now, without further ado, invite the moderator of the second panel, Reto Malacrida, to introduce his panel and moderate it. Reto, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Can I just make sure that everyone can hear me fine? Or else?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to moderate this second panel, having just heard from really a specialist panel. I think it comes as a bit of a relief for some of us, myself certainly, to be able to move to a more generalist panel so that we all can benefit as well from a simpler discussion. So this session is focusing on the impact that COVID-19 has had on public procurement around the world, the specific challenges that this has brought, the lessons that we can learn, and perhaps the changes we can introduce to our respective practices. So it is my great pleasure to be on this panel alongside some very eminent experts, and there are three of them, no less. So if I may begin, first of all, with Professor Chris Yukins. And I leave it up to him whether he would quickly like to switch on the camera just to say hello, but we'll have an opportunity to see him later. So Chris Yukins, as most of you will know, is an eminent professor at the George Washington University. He's a former United States government delegate. I can see him coming up on a little image. So perfect. Thank you for doing that. And as I was saying, he's actually a former United States government of the UNCITRAL Working Group #1. And he's a worldwide authority, obviously, and much in demand these days for his advice. And we will have the pleasure of hearing him on basically the insights that he has gained himself in the context of the various webinars that he has held for a worldwide audience, and he will kindly share some of the insights today with us. If I may move on to the next distinguished panelist, who is Mr. Michel Nussbaumer, who is a director with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He heads up the so-called legal transition team, and he will share with all of us the EBRD legal transition team's experience and its COVID-19 response activities in the public procurement sector. And last, but certainly not least, I have the pleasure of introducing Ms. Erika Bozai. She is a senior policy advisor with the OECD and works there with the Infrastructure and Public Procurement Division. And her intervention today will focus on the OECD's data gathering on public procurement during the pandemic. So obviously this introduction comes nowhere near doing justice to the eminence of our speakers. However, in the interest of time, I hope you will indulge me and allow me to go straight into the question and answer session. And I would propose to begin with Professor Chris Yukins, since he very kindly is already on camera. And I will then move on to Mr. Nussbaumer and conclude with Mrs. Bozai. And I will ask each of them at least one question. And I will, at the end, will invite the speakers to see if they have any concluding comments before offering some brief summary remarks myself. With that set out, allow me to move to my first question for Professor Yukins. So Professor Yukins, having mentioned just a short while ago that you ran a number of seminars on public procurement during this terrible pandemic, my simple question is, has anything surprised you in that context, in the context of the webinars that you held?
Thank you very much. So the webinars that we held were truly international webinars, and we had participants. At one point, we had participants from 6 different continents on at the same time. So we were able to get a cross view of what's happening around the world. A few things surprised me from those webinars. One is just to harken back to the beginning of the UNCITRAL model procurement law process back in 2002, 2003. At that point, there was serious discussion in the literature about using the UNCITRAL process or using something like the UNCITRAL process to create a top-down enforced conformity in procurement laws. And that evolved over to 2003 to 2011 when the law was finalized, and then the guide was published in 2012. What evolved over time was an understanding that instead the UNCITRAL model law really was a collection of best practices. And the best practices reflected the fact that we were able to collect best practices in one document, reflected the fact that procurement laws are really converging all over the world. And this really became manifest during the course of the pandemic, that the dialogue we were having on the webinars, the dialogue we were having internationally during the early stages of the pandemic, and which, by the way, is still very much alive here in the United States, the dialogue we were having during the pandemic was one based on a uniform understanding of what procurement laws are. Their convergence has occurred. Everybody has the same basic laws and understands that. So the dialogue was very fluid because we were all working from the same basic benchmark, the same baseline of procurement laws. The second thing, which is the flip of that, was how divergent the responses were based on local politics. So the local procurement responses really diverged dramatically based on local politics. Here in the United States, there was enormous conflict between the federal government and the state governments competing for supplies. We had close to, for the first time since our Civil War ended in 1865, we had close to armed confrontation between federal and state authorities fighting over these supplies. So what that taught us was, yes, there was a common understanding of procurement law, certainly across the United States here, but that procurement law, the procurement regime bears substantial political risk, that in times of crisis, that procurement regime may buckle in the face of local political conflict, local political diversion. So it's a political risk that we really didn't understand built into the public procurement system. We did not understand that however good the procurement regime is, it may collapse in the face of that sort of political interference or that political turbulence. The third point, and this is a completely separate point, which really, really surprised me, but it's vitally important to the United Nations and the work that we do in the international community, was how important the United Nations is as a distribution system in times of crisis. While there were, and Simon Evanet has done great work on this, in his team at the University of St. Gallen's, tracking what's going on in terms of export and import controls. The United Nations system goes outside that system of export and import controls. In time of crisis, the United Nations may be the only source of emergency supplies because the United Nations is exempt from the import and export controls that are imposed by governments as they panic about access to emergency supplies. So one of the ways to prepare for a future emergency is to understand that the United Nations itself, the distribution system set that the United States has, the United Nations has erected, that distribution system could be vitally important in future emergencies.
Thank you so very much, Professor Yukins, for your answer to my first question. If you allow me, I have a second question for you. And my question is, in your view, what changes will the pandemic bring to the world of public procurement?
So the first is the introduction of a new concept that we really haven't talked about in public procurement before, which is the concept of resilience of supply. And this is a concept that's an inherent part of any discussion of supply chain issues in the private sector. But in the public sector, we've always assumed that buyers would be able to gain access to the goods that they need. Not necessarily true in the pandemic. So figuring out strategies for resilience of supply is I think the major change that's going to come about in public procurement, anticipating the next emergency and how public entities can gain access to supplies on a resilient basis. Now, to put the context for this, and the United States is actually a good case study for this. The United States has, for decades, considered most of medical supplies a private good. It's dealt with in the private industry. For most people, have private insurance. It is a matter of the normal economics of the country that you gain access to medical services, to medical supplies. In the pandemic, suddenly things that were private goods turned into public goods, that in essence, every citizen had a right to a ventilator, or every citizen had a right to we're going to see this in the vaccines. The vaccines will probably be distributed for free. So historically, we would have considered private goods became public goods. And so suddenly things that were needed in the private sector historically suddenly become part of the public procurement system. And the public procurement system has to have enough flex to be able to accommodate what is a huge number of new huge number of new public goods, these things that everybody has an expectation, every citizen has an expectation of access to these. So in dealing with these public goods, the question is how procurement systems should respond. And what the United States is doing right now is the United States is responding by stockpiling. And stockpiling, I think, is an acknowledgement of a massive failure in the procurement system. A country or a government stockpiles only because it acknowledges the procurement system won't work adequately in a time of emergency. And so we're stockpiling, and that creates enormous risk for the government because this government doesn't really know whether or not it's stockpiling the right goods. That's the stockpiling doesn't really answer the problem because the next emergency may have a different nature. So stockpiling shifts risk from the suppliers and creates enormous new risk for the government. The governments are impliedly acknowledging that. In terms of resilience of supply, they're developing alternative means. And it's a coincidence, but not completely a coincidence, that in the middle of all this, the federal government here has opened up commercial platforms such as Amazon. They're opening up these commercial platforms so that government users can buy directly from those commercial platforms. In essence, the government is outsourcing the procurement function to large private logistics providers like Amazon in order to reduce the risk of responding to the next pandemic. Now, it's a historical coincidence that those two things are happening at the same time, but you can really see that the government is looking over its shoulder. It's addressing things that have the most political risk attached to them, those critical supplies that are needed in this crisis. They're stockpiling those. But wise people inside the government understand that other supplies that can't be anticipated today, other supplies will be needed in the future, and therefore the government is relying on private supply chains to supply those really critically needed goods so that in the next pandemic or the next, let's say there's a nuclear disaster, in the next emergency, the government can be adequately prepared by relying upon really primarily private supply chains. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Yukins, for sharing these fascinating insights. I, for one, certainly learned a lot from them, and we'll be happy to share them with other people and experts, so that would be great. For now, that completes my questions to you, Professor Yukins. I will offer you the floor again towards the end if we have time. And at this point, I'd like to direct a question to Mr. Nussbaumer, as I had mentioned. And since he works for the EBRD, my question is targeting the EBRD, and specifically, I would like to ask him how his institution helps countries in its area of operations with their public procurement response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and what lessons the EBRD has learned. Mr. Nussbaumer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you confirm you can hear me well? Yes?
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. Hello, everybody. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, has come up with a 4 billion euro solidarity package very quickly after the crisis started, with the aim to finance private sector companies and governments to help them survive the crisis. So this is for the investment side, but the solidarity package also includes a policy response to COVID-19. And in the field of public procurement, this is done by the EBRD Legal Transition Program that I'm in charge of, working also with the bank's procurement department. And under that program, the EBRD works with governments on policy dialogue and legislative reforms. So my remarks will focus on the legal and regulatory framework applicable to public procurement. And this is where I should mention that EBRD has been collaborating with the UNCITRAL since 2011 on an initiative to promote transparency and fair competition in public procurement in our countries of operations. So for the past decade, EBRD and UNCITRAL have worked together to help countries in Central Asia, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, North Africa, to upgrade their legislative framework for public procurement. And we are using the UNCITRAL model law on public procurement as a promotional tool for this initiative. And of course, this work has become even more relevant and needed now in the COVID-19 crisis context. So what did we observe in the context of the pandemic on the side of legislation and regulation? I would like to highlight two trends. The first one, we have experienced an increased appetite for digital procurement tools because governments were not sufficiently prepared to deliver the public procurement function online at a time where all officers were working from home. And the second trend I will talk about is a rush to enact emergency regulations in an attempt to speed up purchases critical for COVID response, in particular for medical equipment. So let me look into both these trends. First, the renewed appetite for digital procurement tools. Implementing transparent and quick digital public procurement methods used to be considered a luxury item by governments, but overnight it became a necessity. And a lot of governments requested an acceleration of the ongoing technical cooperation projects. For example, we have seen that in Tunisia, in the Kyrgyz Republic. And if I can share an example, which is very encouraging, the bank supports creating independent and fair public procurement complaints procedures. And we have been working with the Anti-Monopoly Committee of Ukraine since it was appointed as public procurement review body. And in the Ukrainian system, the complaint mechanism is supposed to be electronic. But until the COVID-19 crisis, the discussion about online hearings was only theoretical. We had prepared a pilot, but there was reluctance to put it in practice. And when the COVID-19 lockdown started, online hearings became a necessity and the pilot was launched immediately. So we can see a positive effect of COVID-19 on this process. Now, just a few words about the second trend we have observed, the enactment of emergency procurement regulations to deal with purchasing of COVID-related equipment. Now, we all know that when countries enact emergency procurement, there is a risk it may involve direct awarding, prepayments, lack of quality control at delivery, and more generally, this might lead to a lack of transparency. For example, I understand that Romania has introduced emergency legislation for a couple of months to allow public entities to purchase medical equipment by direct award outside the online procurement system. That was between March and May this year. However, our view at EBRD is that it is possible to deal with emergency purchases while still complying with full transparency and competitiveness. We have been working on electronic framework agreements for procurement of medical products by central purchasing bodies since 2017 in Ukraine, in Moldova, in Tunisia. And it's very good to see that in Ukraine, even during COVID-19 crisis, all emergency public procurement, including medical, has been kept electronic in the national e-procurement system, Prozoro, and was subject, therefore, to online civic monitoring of tenders and spending. So this is an approach that our bank fully supports, digital procurement from planning to payment, even in a crisis context. And the data should be automatically published from the e-procurement system and in open contracting data standards so that monitoring is evidence-based and can be trusted by all stakeholders, governments, business, and citizens. So you were asking me for the lessons learned by EBRD from the COVID-19 crisis in public procurement. Just to sum up, I think there are 3 lessons. First, there is a need for comprehensive digital tools. The COVID-19 crisis has shown that governments need to enact fully digital systems for public procurement, because when you have end-to-end digital process, your procurement officers can work from home and still get things done to a good standard. The second lesson, there is a need to track government expenditures through transparent online data, particularly in the case of emergency purchases during COVID-19 lockdown. The availability of such data allows to check that critical public services are delivered in the best conditions and that leakage due to mismanagement or corruption is minimized. And finally, the last lesson, emergency regulations must be only temporary. In the midterm, when governments move from immediate pandemic response to long-term recovery and reform, we must ensure that they do not retain emergency procurement legislation longer than necessary, because keeping these exceptional substandard public procurement policies may damage markets and businesses, in particular SMEs, which are so crucial for boosting the economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nussbaumer, for these extremely interesting practice-oriented remarks, and for being extremely clear also about the main phenomena that we have seen arise now in the response and the challenges that we face going forward. So thank you so much. I'd leave it at that for now and would move on to our colleague Erika Bozet to address a question or two to her, if I may. So the first question relates to the fact that the OECD, as many of us will know, has published an extremely useful stock-taking report on the immediate public procurement and infrastructure responses that governments took in the early phases of the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of data collection went on. And I understand that you also organized webinars on the same topics and had several bilateral discussions with various countries. So based on all of that information you have been able to gather to date, what, in your view, were the most commonly used public procurement tools and public procurement approaches in the early days of the pandemic? Mrs. Bozet, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Rico. Can you please confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting OECD for this panel discussion. It's a great honor for me to be part of this panel. And thank you very much, Rico, for your question. And I also really appreciate that you mentioned the stock-taking report that OECD published in May. This report provides a snapshot of the immediate policy responses in the field of public procurement and also infrastructure governance taken by the OECD countries, but it also covers some non-OECD countries and also provides some information about the policy responses taken by the European Commission. As I said, this is a snapshot of the policy responses taken by the countries. So it presents these responses without going into deeper analysis or without drawing lessons for the future. However, I would like to mention that we are currently finalizing the policy brief, the policy paper that is analyzing these responses and provide policy insights for future emergencies or even, let's say, the second or third phase of this current crisis. Because I think, and I think it was already mentioned in the previous interventions, we can learn a lot from these immediate responses in the first phase for the future, and that's why we really need to analyze all these replies. This policy brief will be published soon, hopefully in the coming days or weeks. And yes, we also had some webinars, we also had some several bilateral discussions with our member countries. So basically, these are the main sources of our knowledge and information of what happened in the different countries. What did we see? Obviously, public procurement was at the front line of many countries' responses to the crisis. And what we also see that countries, especially OECD countries, generally used their established policy and legal frameworks for emergency contracting, while they also provided additional guidance and support to their contracting authorities on how to use these special emergency rules correctly. Because we all know that procurement practitioners are trained to use competitive procedures, while emergency procurement or emergency contracting means direct contracting, direct sourcing, and this is what is not part of the normal operation. So they really need clear guidance about what to do, how to do, to respect the rules, respect the transparency, accountability, and other principles as far as possible. But I don't really want to talk about the details of this emergency contracting or the legal framework, as it was already mentioned by the previous interventions. I would like to focus rather on some other policy responses that we saw in several countries, also on regional and international levels. I think we can agree that the whole situation was something new for all public, for all governments. Because of course, they have some kind of experience doing tendering with extreme urgency, because we already had some experience with previous emergency situation. But this situation was extremely new. There were high uncertainty about the circumstances. We lived in a rapidly changing environment. So it was a radically new purchasing environment for all the public buyers. Mr. Yukins already mentioned that in the US, they experienced fierce competition between public buyers, between the different states. And this is what we also saw in other countries, in OECD countries, that they, of course, wanted to purchase the same products, the same services. So basically, they were competing with each other because at the same time, the crisis or the pandemic forced other governments to do the same. And we could see this kind of competition between public buyers, not only on national level, but also, let's say, between different countries, between different regions. At the same time, there were serious disruption in supply chains. Several countries introduced export prohibitions and restrictions. And also the market responded in several unexpected ways. For example, I just mentioned one, many suppliers were demanding advance payment to secure supplies. So these new challenges required adaptive policy responses and new alliances. And amongst the various immediate measures, I would like to highlight these collaborative and cooperative purchasing approaches that we saw in several countries. So these kind of different forms of collaboration, cooperation was a kind of response from several countries to these new challenges. We could see this kind of collaboration, cooperation on national level, but again, on regional level or on supranational level as well. Even the World Health Organization recommended to its members the greater use of centralized purchasing, the better communication and cooperation between the different players. And when I say collaborative approaches and coordination, of course, it includes centralized purchasing methods and approaches, but not only these. We could also see several other forms, means for collaboration, such as launching joint procurements. Here I would like to mention one example. I think all of us heard about the joint procurement agreement, which was launched by the European Commission and which included several countries, all the member states of the European Union, but also some other countries outside of the European Union, such as Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, but also candidate countries or potential candidates in the Western Balkan countries. So the European Commission has launched 4 different calls for joint procurement procedures to purchase vital products such as personal protective equipment. And I also would like to mention here that this joint procurement agreement, it's not a new initiative of the European Union, because the idea for this goes back to the 2009 H1N1 pandemic influenza. So it also gives us a good example that we really need to analyze all these kind of responses. We need to understand which are those practices which can be useful for future emergencies, future pandemics. Another form for these collaborative or coordinative approaches is the whole of the government coordination, or even whole of the society coordination. I think it was also really important in several countries that the procurement response was part of the whole of the government response to the crisis. In several countries, the national response to the coronavirus supported by a dedicated governance structure to ensure public health, whole of the society approach. In several countries, a kind of national public health emergency team for COVID-19 was set up, and usually the institutions in charge of purchasing emergency health and other products were represented in this coordination body. We saw it in Ireland, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Canada, just to name a few, but again, the list is quite long here as well. Or even we could see several examples for coordinating efforts through exchanging information, improving communication, again, both on national level and also on international level. So this is what we also see, that even if countries or national institutions are not implementing the joint procurement or not using centralized purchasing, but at least if they exchange information with each other, it can also help with the fight against the corruption. I would like to mention here an example. We saw in several countries that they developed a tool that is matching the demand for medical equipment and other goods needed to tackle coronavirus with the demand that the market can offer. Also, here I can mention an example from the European Union. The European Commission, for example, set up a clearinghouse for medical equipment for a period of 6 months that facilitates the identification of the available supplies into the testing kits, and this way accelerates the matching with the demand by the European member states. But we could see also these kind of supplier search tools in several other countries, even tools which were developed by the private sector. So we saw also initiatives coming from the private sector or even from the civil society. So, for example, there was also a tool which was developed by the Standard Network. And coming back to centralized purchasing, which is also one of the collaborative approaches that was used during the pandemic. Just would like to mention that, of course, in several countries that were already set up institutions, established institutions for centralized purchasing for health products. And during this pandemic, these CPBs, central purchasing bodies, did a great job to purchase the necessary products, health products and tools. And we saw that even in countries which are generally or traditionally reluctant to use centralized purchasing, they try to set up this kind of centralized approach, at least for the pandemic. I can mention Germany, for example, as an example. Of course, it's not just a reluctance coming from the federal state establishment of Germany that centralized purchasing is not that common. And finally, my final example that I would like to mention, that we also saw new ways, new means of engaging with the market. So governments started to engage with the market in a new way, new experimental ways, because they try to find alternative and innovative solutions for their needs. And we can see these examples throughout OECD countries. I'm pretty sure that all of you heard about the Yukins initiative to purchase ventilators, but similar initiatives were introduced by Canada, Italy, Ireland, and the list is quite long. And I would like to stop here, because of course there were some other important responses, but these were already partially mentioned by the previous interventions. And on the other hand, we have limited time, so I stop here and I'm happy to answer further questions.
Thank you so very much for this most comprehensive and informative answer. It's great that you were able to touch upon procurement tools beyond those that Mr. Nussbaumer had already identified. So we really get a whole gamut now of instruments to consider and take a closer look at. So I have a little bird in my ear that tells me that at this point, with an eye on time, I would do best to hand back the floor to our appreciated chairman, and that we may have an opportunity later on for further comments from our distinguished panel. But for now, I would like to return the floor to Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much to all the panelists for your most interesting and insightful comments. It was really a treat to listen to all of you. And with those comments, I'll hand back to Angelo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reto, for these concluding remarks. And we're really sorry that we had to cut these very interesting presentations short, because I'm sure that there were plenty of other examples, particularly in the area of digitalization of public procurement, that could have been enlightening. But I see that we have a number of states asking to take the floor, and I will start with a comment coming from Vietnam. If you would kindly introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, dear Chairman and the chairmanship. I'm Vũ Lê. I'm from the Public Procurement Agency of the Ministry of Planning and Investment for Vietnam. I'm here to share about our experience of development of our first PPP law, and with the special technical assistance from the UNCITRAL team from back to 2019. And until recently, we have successfully had it approved by our National Assembly on June 18. So it's actually a journey from the very beginning of thinking about the new PPP law. Previously, it was at the government decree, and we were lucky that it happened during the time that the UNCITRAL have issued the new model law on PPP, and we can benefit a lot from that, not only for the content of the procurement procedure, but also on other issues like what I'm going to talk here. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is who we are, and our Public Procurement Agency has tasked the government and our National Assembly to draft two laws that is quite relevant to to the themes of this seminar. The one was procurement law, public procurement law, which was promulgated in 2013, and the new PPP law of this year. So next slide, please. So since the early of this year, COVID happened to our country, and you can see on the screen that in April, we were practicing the social distancing, and almost no economic activity happened, and we have to do most of the thing online, and our our job to develop the new PP law was also happened under this circumstance. And with this in mind, we we reflect a lot of things that that's allow the flexibility for the PPP implementation in this unexpected situation like this. And now, luckily, we can come to the normal life. Next slide, please. For PPP, the new law applied to 5 sectors, basically the transportation, the energy, the healthcare, the IT infrastructure, and the clean water supply, drainage, and wastewater treatment. So those are the necessity for the normal operation of the society. And that's why we have to focus on the continuation of the service regardless of any disruption. So next slide, please. So next, please. The law has present basically two families of the contract type, the user fee type and the availability payment types, and mixed contract can also be possible. Next slide, please. Yeah, next, please. And next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. And the law also requires that the state have to reserve some the appropriate resource to participate into these two types, whether it is a contribution as a viability get funding during the construction period, or the payment throughout the life cycle of the contract. Next slide, please. And the new law focuses on the sharing of the risk with the private sector and with the balance of 50-50 sharing. Next slide, please. What about the contract continuation? Article 47 requests that the operation of business, of the facility, and of the service must be continuously and stably provided. Next, please. Article 50 requires that if in the case of force majeure or the substantial change of circumstance, like what is happening now for the COVID, then there must be the revision of the project contracts. Next slide, please. And Article 39 allow for the direct appointment for the sake of ensuring the continuity of the service. So all of this we learn from our current situation, practice in Vietnam, and also we benefit a lot from the standard regulation, the standard guideline from the PP, the model PP law. So we'd say a great thanks to all the team who draft and who developed the model law, which play as the guidance for us, and your continuous assistance to our effort here in the developing country like us. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this contribution, which allows us to get the feedback directly from the agency that is implementing this PPP legislation. So thank you for that. I'm told that the next speaker is from Guinea. You have the floor. It's Madame Silla. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Thank you. My name is Hawa Diallo. I'm from Guinea, and I'm the Vice Minister in charge of investment and public-private partnership. So I want to thank you for inviting me to this webinar and giving me the opportunity to share with you Guinea's experience. As you know, Guinea is a country very rich in natural resources, bauxite, diamond, iron in its soil, but with a lack of essential infrastructure. In order to exploit its potential, there is a real need to invest in various sectors to promote inclusive growth. A national plan for the economic and social development, PNDES, current period of 2016-2020 was adopted. Up to 38% of the planned budget, i.e. $5.5 billion will be funded by using public-private partnership schemes. According to the importance of the investment, the country had to endow itself an appropriate regulatory framework for PPPs. So the new PPP law was promulgated in 2017. Contrary to the various countries that have a longer experience in PPPs, we have about 5 contracts, and the majority have been signed during 2019. The law is more complete, secure, and includes different types of instruments, BOT, delegated public services concessions, because before the PPP law, Guinea used to adopt a law on BOT schemes only. And the COVID-19 pandemic occurred while we're still working on the operationalization of the law, specifically on the application decrees. This pandemic highlighted our low resilience in various sectors. In health, low level of qualification of medical staff, inadequate and poorly equipped health infrastructure. In education, children have been deprived of the right to access education due to the lack of infrastructure facilitating distance learning. In agriculture, farmers have suffered considerable crop losses because of shutting down and the closure of borders. So the financing of the infrastructure gap will become even more acute as the government has set up an economic response plan for almost 300 million euro to support a precarious private sector, which was totally unexpected. Therefore, PPP remain one of the key instruments for the recovery of our economy. However, it must be pointed out that there will be no sustainable development of PPPs without a favorable legislative, regulatory, and institutional framework. A business environment, this type of partnership based on risk sharing, a strengthening of managerial capacity of administrations concerned as well as of the national private sector, full and transparent communication of all budgetary risk arising from PPPs, and PPPs are particularly risky in a context of corruption. The fight against corruption is one of the main priorities of Guinean government. So this is the work that are in progress to facilitate investment and minimize the resulting risk. I would point out that our policy of PPPs with a strong involvement of the local private sector in order to promote inclusive growth. Our efforts are focused to work preventively to ensure a successful implementation of PPP, and we are fully in line with the UNCITRAL legislative guide, which set out a number of precautions to ensure that PPP investment will be more profitable. That is why in the post-COVID strategic plan that had been drawn up by the government, a particular emphasis was placed on revival of PPPs in certain aspects such as increase in cost or contract adjustment caused by the pandemic will take into account. The invocation of force majeure clauses to initiate a dialogue with the private promoter about contract duration, regulatory flexibility, and performance indicators are in phase with provision 45 of the legislative guide. Termination under provision 51 may become a reality. Then we really think that the UNCITRAL guide will help us to facilitate investment in public and social infrastructure through PPPs, and also will help to protect the public, investors, financial partners' interests according to the best practices, rule of good governance with efficient and transparent procedures, compliance with the national legal framework. So that is my contribution, because we are almost, I can say, a newborn when the PPPs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madame Silla, for your contribution and for the examples you have given us of the investment in social infrastructure. I see that Italy has asked for the floor. Could I ask you to kindly introduce yourself?
Good evening. Can you hear me? Yes, and see. Good evening to all the participants, and many thanks to UNCITRAL Secretariat for the invitation and for giving us the opportunity to bring our experience to this panel. My brief contribution will focus on an Italian experience from the point of view of Italian anti-corruption authority, which I belong to as a law official. The contribution has been drafted with the coordination of Professor Nicoletta Parisi, member of the board of the authority in charge for international activity, and the precious collaboration of my colleague Silvia Pomes. So in brief, my presentation on behalf of Italy will focus on, first of all, the impact of the sanitary emergency due to COVID-19 on public procurement in Italy. Point 2, the most important measures adopted by Italian government and the guidelines provided by Italian anti-corruption authority to support public procurement sector. And point 3, at the end, the presentation also focuses on particular cases occurred in the PPP contract in order to outline or to try to outline some of the main criticalities that the emergency brought out. The Italian Anti-Corruption Authority annual report submitted to the government and the parliament on the 2nd of July 2020 points out how COVID-19 emergency deeply affected public procurement in Italy. Since 2017, the demand for public contracts in Italy has grown significantly, and the positive trend continued in 2019 with an overall increase of about 8% in the number of procedures started and of about 23% in the amount of public expenditure. On the opposite, the first quarter of 2020 shows a relevant decrease in the procurement procedure, taking into account new calls for tenders, which is hovering around 24% as far as it concerns the number of procedures, and around 33% as far as it concerns the global economic amount. Looking closer to the procurement strictly dealing with the necessity to face the ongoing sanitary emergency, the global amount stands around 3 billion euros, the 95% of which refers to health supplies of protective devices, medical funds, and gowns. The majority of public contracts over 40,000 euro have been awarded through procedures with no publication of tender, the 77%, or through direct assignment, 20%, mainly by central purchasing bodies or central bodies, around 57%. In order to deal with the COVID-19 emergency, the Italian government introduced regulatory intervention and legislative amendments to the Italian Public Contract Code, the Law Decree number 50 of 216. This aimed at speeding up and streamlining public procurement processes, increasing the possibility for contracting authorities to use simplified procurement procedures, and extending deadlines for administrative procedures pending on the 23rd of February 2020. And also in view of ensuring the supply of personal protective equipment and medical devices related to the emergency. Most of the substantial law amendments has been introduced with the Law Decree number 18 of March 2020, the so-called Cura Italia, which provided the possibility for the contracting authorities to recourse to the negotiated procedure without a prior call for tenders and to sign the contract and execute it immediately after the end of the procedure without having to comply with a standstill period of 35 days. Moving from the information given by the UE Commission with the Communication 2020 concerning options and flexibilities available under EU public procurement framework for the purchase of the supplies, services and works needed to address the emergency situation related to COVID-19, the Italian National Anti-Corruption Authority has issued a special handbook. It was published on the 9th of April 2020 with the aim of supporting contracting authorities with a systematic overview of the already existing law provisions which ordinarily allow accelerated and simplified tender procedures for the award of public works, services and supplies contracts, even beyond the sanitary emergency and even beyond the health sector. With a view to promoting and supporting a more general economic recovery and ensuring a speedy timeframe for the tendering procedures as well. The authority is also providing technical support to the government in the ongoing process of legislative reform in the field of public procurement, with an attempt of balancing instances for acceleration and simplification from one side, and the compliance with the European General Principles on Public Procurement, and moreover, safeguards for legality and transparency on the other side. Among the available simplification measures, if legal requirements are met, it is possible to mention the possibility of the assignment without prior publication of the notice when specific condition occurs, the reduction of the terms of the ordinary award procedures with reference both to above threshold and below threshold tenders, the exclusion of the standstill period, the early execution of the agreement, the extension of the possibility of recourse to negotiated proceeding without prior publication of the notice, and the simplification in the procedure of verification of anomalous bidding. It has also been brought to the attention of the contracting authorities that the legal framework already allows amendments to contractual agreements during the period of execution due to unforeseeable and unexpected events. This under Article 106 of Legislative Decree number 50 of 216. And some clarifications were also given on the provision concerning the termination of the agreement. And finally, it has also been enhanced the preventive collaborative surveillance on public procurement, an instrument by which the anti-corruption authority supports the contracting authorities in the management of the public procurement procedure by helping them in the proper implementation and enforcement of the law. As far as PPP contracts are concerned, on the basis of the experience the Italian National Anti-Corruption Authority gained during the most critical phase of the pandemic emergency, it is possible to highlight that some criticalities occurred. Let me preface that many of the simplification and accelerated measures listed above find correspondence in some provision of the UNCITRAL model law. Just think at Model Provision 23, that allows direct negotiation in case of urgent need due to unforeseeable circumstances, or at Model Provision 14, Paragraph 2, Letter C, that indirectly introduce the possibility to negotiate terms. Let me also preface that in the last few years before 2020, PPP contracts benefited from the positive trends of the market of public procurement, as it has been observed an improvement in the number of PPP, even if not always corresponding to a proper use of contractual instrument by the contracting authorities. So the emergency due to the COVID-19 has occurred in an expanding sector. It is too early to measure the impact of the emergency in terms of numbers of contracts or procedures affected by criticalities or in terms of lost opportunities. But it is definitely possible to point out some first outcomes. For example, it has been observed a significant impact in the tender procedures of the change in economic conditions related to the sanitary emergency, which made it necessary to explore the possibility to change part of the procurement document and subsequently the bid, especially as it concerns financial terms of the proposal, after the starting of the selection procedure. Just think at a PPP concerning the construction and management of new university buildings within an already existing campus, with original financial terms partly related to the pre-COVID-19 foreseeable trend of the incomes related to the university taxes, and the impact on this provision of the collapse of university enrollments due to the consequence of the sanitary emergency. Both national and international provision currently consider only 3 instances for the adjustment of the financial equilibrium of the contract. At first, it is considered the possibility for the national contracting authorities to ask the proponent to make changes to the proposal before initiating the selection procedure. These are under UNCITRAL Model Provision 16 and Italian Public Contract Code Article 183. A second instance concerns the startup phase of the selection procedure, as it can be included in the procurement documents the possibility for the bidders to introduce in their tender proposal of amendments under UNCITRAL Model Provision 22 and Italian Public Contract Code Article 183. The third instance is related to amendment and modification of the contract after conclusion. It is disciplined under UNCITRAL Model Provision 45. But what if the need for relevant changes, such as modification of economic terms, arise during the period of time between the submission of the tender and the award of the contract? Is it possible to negotiate if the original procedural terms and conditions do not include negotiation with the bidders? And what if there is only one bidder? Is it efficient to impose the renewal of the procedure in the name of competition? Is it consistent with an emergency period? As far as national law is concerned, the Italian National Anti-Corruption Authority outlines that according to administrative case law, substantial changes to procurement documents, such can be a modification of financial equilibrium, must be published in the same way as the original documents were, and it is also necessary to assign new terms for the submission of the tenders. Whereas to start a negotiation with the bidder, where not originally provided from the procurement documents, may affect competition, unless in case of urgent need or other circumstances strictly related and indicated by the law, but they must be pointed out clearly. Other cases occurred in which, on the basis of an assumption of urgent need related to the sanitary emergency, current or possible PPP contracts have been set aside in favor of other forms of direct negotiation with different economic operators. This happened, for example, in the field of medical supplies, with specific reference to the development, testing, and commercialization of diagnostic kit for COVID-19, as some contracting authorities put in place agreements for scientific research with substantial commercial aspects that leave those agreements outside the scope permitted by the law. The practices have been condemned by the administrative case law in Italy. The administrative judge in Lombardia, in a sentence of the 8th of June 2020, as it has been outlined that resorting to the form of a scientific agreement instead of public procurement procedure may favor one specific economic operator that obtains a competitive advantage in the achievement of a new product by using a public structure, such as a research structure of a public hospital, while maintaining exclusive commercial availability of the product itself. On the contrary, the administrative judge has made it clear that a contractual relationship between the contracting authority that provides scientific support and laboratories and the economic operator that provides prototype with the intent of testing them and support and subsequently put them on the market has to be considered a concession of public property in view of achieving a result of public interest, and therefore requires a public tender procedure for the selection of the economic operator. It appears to be clear, on the basis of this recent statement of the administrative judge, that in this field there is room for a strategic use of PPP with good results in terms of efficiency of public action. And this is for our experience and our contribution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to Italy for their contribution to the discussion. We are coming very dangerously close to the time that we're supposed to close our webinar. That's the time originally foreseen for the availability of this platform. I would like to thank both the panelists, the speakers of both panels for their presentations, and also like to thank the states that intervened to share their experience. It's of course for us always very good to learn that our instruments developed internationally are also on the ground being tested, and the solutions they provide have been found to be workable solutions not only in terms of providing flexibility, but also providing parameters for the exercise of that flexibility in a manner that ensures transparency and integrity, both in procurement process, but also later on in the contract management and contract adaptation. Those were crucial things, not only in the revision of the PPP instruments, but also in the revision of the model law that led to the adoption of the model law on public procurement in 2011. So I believe that I speak for all participants that are following us today in expressing our appreciation for a set of excellent presentations. I thank you all. And Madam Secretary, I think I would be guilty of dereliction of duty if I would fail to wish you a happy Bastille Day, and also to Laurence Folliot, who cared to join us in the French national holiday today. Thank you very much. And I look forward to all the participants joining us at tomorrow's webinar, which is on dispute resolution. By the way, you saw there was one question on the chat room about the role of arbitrators in all the COVID-related and PPP-related disputes. This is certainly something that will be discussed tomorrow. And so join us again. Thank you very much for being with us today. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.